Hello and welcome to Creative Outcomes. I am your host, Ryan Watson, co-founder and partner at Upsourced Accounting. I am joined by fellow co-founder and partner, Craig Baldwin. Craig, how we doing, buddy?
I'm doing very well. How are you, Ryan?
I'm good. I'm
Yeah,
good. Another 70-degree day here in Dayton, Ohio. Can't complain.
that's lucky you. Yeah, it's not quite that warm right now in Columbus, but it's pretty close. Speaking of warm, I think we want to talk about, I don't know, revenue,
Nice
pipeline.
segue.
Hopefully those things are warm for most of you that are watching and listening. But out of the benchmark survey that we released just a couple months ago, and Ryan, I know you actually gave a very nice presentation to the Bureau of Digital or Bureau crowd at the Bureauverse in Austin just last week. It seems like there were some useful insights that came out of that would indicate that not all agencies, depending on where they are in their journey, are ready for scale, i.e., revenue growth.
Yeah.
And I think you probably have a lot to say about this topic.
Yeah.
So hopefully that was a nice way to tee you up and let you discuss some of the themes that you noticed as a part of your work and the research that we've done.
Yeah, well, and I guess I'll just kind of set that up too, because if you haven't read the benchmarking report, I would encourage you to hit pause and go check it out because it is really interesting and there's an enormous amount of data. But one of the things we talked about, sort of at length in Austin, was there's a number of really interesting insights about within that report. But I think the thing that stuck out to me the most, that I found the most fascinating, is when we were looking at the sort of benchmark profitability. And we looked at it in a variety of ways, but we looked at it by size of firm, right? Small firm being like 1 to 10, medium being 11 to 25, large being 26 to 50, and then of course, super beyond that. And I'd say intuitively, and like I suspect many of you would think, that the profitability of a firm would sort of grow proportionately to its size, because you get operating leverage, right? The bigger you are, the easier it is to spread your sort of fixed costs over a larger base of revenue. You just get more profitable as you grow, as you get bigger. And what we found is that is exactly not true. That's not at all what happened. And what happened was one of our least profitable segments was within our largest firms in the study, that 26 to 50. And so that was kind of what kicked off. We had a lot of really good discussions about what ultimately was driving that. And at the heart of, what are some things that are true about firms that are not ready, to grow, and or not ready or not built for or prepared for the sort of, the pace of growth. So anyway, let me throw some out at you that we kind of kicked around and talked about, and you feel free to jump in. So again, prompt being like, what are some signs that are firms that are not ready for the pace of revenue growth? Let me start with one that's actually not in the data, but I think it's like kind of foundationally required, which is your team isn't oriented for growth, as in like you haven't contracted with your organization and made the contract that, hey, we are seeking revenue growth. And what I mean by that is like, so here's a sign. You have team members who say things like, I really like being small and it's really comfortable here, and ooh, that feels a little bit too fast. And I guess the point I wanted to make initially was, we can debate whether there is a valid strategy out there of like sort of keeping revenue flat, right? If that is even a concept that is worth pursuing. But assuming it is, if you are pursuing growth, like that's a very specific strategy, and it's a specific kind of an organization. And your team needs to understand the ride they're on, because the ride they're on is going to create maybe a little bit more chaos. It's going to create a little bit, we're going to get pinched at the margins a little bit more. We're going to have to innovate a little bit quicker. Like, we have to sign up for a particular journey, and that journey is not, punching 28-hour weeks. It just looks different. And if you don't have a team that's ready for that, I think you're going to be pushing upstream kind of the whole way. Does that make sense? Do you ever see that? You see firms that are like, the managers or the partners are like, we want to grow, but the team is like, We're not interested in that. We don't see why. We're not on board with that, or we haven't explicitly kind of signed up for that ride.
We see it very often, and it comes in different fashions. It comes in situations where there are owners who are removed from the business day to day and they want cash flow and additional cash flow, and they're asking the leadership team for growth, and the growth excuse me, the leadership team then has to ask the rest of the team to orient themselves around growth. We see it in organizations who are first time business owners, and they've been skillful and lucky enough to maybe hire the first 3 to 4 employees, and they want to get out of that sort of messy time period where they're at that scale, and they want to get to 10, they want to get to 15, they want to get to 20. And especially in those early days, which I always kind of refer to as the pirate ship phase, um, it requires not only certain mindset, but I think in a lot of ways certain skills from those team members. You can't just be a bump on a log during that time period. Um, and then what we also see, and by the way, we've certainly gone through as an organization ourselves, but I think we've actually experienced this in other organizations we've been a part of, is when you are in sort of the middle of your journey, and let's say that you're 15 to 20 to 25 employees, but you want to keep growing and you want to get to 50, 100, 200. There's a lot of friction that comes with that as well. It's where I say that you kind of have to make this dramatic shift from the pirate ship phase to the British Royal Navy phase, which is I have lieutenants, they're managing functional areas of the business or areas which are tied to certain portions of revenue. And this is where more systems come in. This is where there's less sort of like nonverbal communication that did us really well in the old days, but doesn't now. Likely requires a pretty significant culture change or overhaul. So all of these are different reasons uh, for really friction within organizations as it relates to revenue and revenue growth. And I didn't even mention like some of the obvious ones, which is just like, hey, we scored a big client and now we have to find a way to service this. And by default, we are growing. And because of this, I have to hire a few more people, and I better go find the next deal so I can keep those few more people around more than like 6 months, right? I think a lot of people get on this treadmill and they don't really realize it at the time, and then they wake up one morning and they realize they've got like a 20-person agency, and they're like, holy crap, how do I keep this thing going? And so I commonly call that the ladder effect. We see this very frequently within our client portfolio, which is clients who had um, some pretty good growth. This is especially true during the pandemic, and they get up to 20, 25 people, and they realize, holy crap, this is hard to maintain. The business environment changes. As we all know, it's changing super fast all the time. And they have to lay off some people. And they go down to 15, maybe even back down to 10. I call it the ladder effect because they get up to the top, they look down, they go, holy crap, I want to go back down now. Right. And then those are the types of agencies who will look to us and say, yeah, we actually used to be bigger. And I just don't think I want to be that big again. I never meant to do that. That was an accident. I just want to stay here for a while, right? And our I think our instinctual response is always like, yeah, sure you do. But I get it. It's a very natural evolution of many agencies, especially in a project-based world. It is for many owners the first time they've really been roughed up in a significant way. They don't want that feeling again, at least not right away. And so they'll do anything they can not to have that feeling of having to lay a bunch of people off
Right,
again, or to,
exactly. True. Retreating to
have
safety, right?
having
That cocoon
failure.
where,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Having to face failure in such a significant way. And so I think what you've done a pretty good job of, at least over the last couple of weeks, is articulating just some common things to think about um, before you embark on climbing that ladder again, or before you embark on going from 5 employees to 10, or before you embark on trying to find more revenue because the chairman or the owner who's not involved day to day said you got to find it. Um, these are all very common situations that we see each and every day with our clients. But I don't think they're looking at it another layer deeper like we are with regard to structurally, are they ready for it, even if they could find it?
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, totally. So again, I just wanted to make the point that like, listen, the first step is like you got to make sure that everybody's on board with wanting all of the things that come along with growth, because it is a specific kind of experience. Now, the thing that you mentioned, your analogy of sort of moving from the pirate ship phase to the British Royal Navy phase and aligning, assigning lieutenants. I think that's a really good segue into, I think, the first structural thing I want to talk about, because this is ultimately what we saw in that data where we saw the sort of 26 to 50 person firms, generate worse financial outcomes than their smaller counterparts. And I think what we saw in that situation is that, they were seeing revenue increase. And for the first time in the evolution of their business, their margins decline, particularly the margins on their projects. And what was interesting is we saw, like, we dug into the data, and it was not a utilization problem. It wasn't that like they had a bunch of people sitting around all of a sudden for the first time, because the bigger you get, the easier it is to manage the utilization problem. They saw that their actual project margins, like their realized rate, plummeted into this stage. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the biggest reason for that is that they were blowing scope. Like, the coordination among their team got a lot worse. The quality and consistency of their service declined, and they were going way over these budgeted hours. And the reason for that is that they got to the size of revenue where, as you mentioned, the pirate ship phase doesn't work anymore, right? We talk about this as a firm with regard to like our grow mode playbook. And we say, like, listen, there comes a point where you've outgrown the operating model that was successful at a previous size. And now you've got to step into a new operating model. And before you do that, if you don't do it, you're going to see profitability plummet. You're going to see like internal satisfaction among employees deteriorate. You're going to see client satisfaction deteriorate. And it's because you're struggling. Like, basically, you're trying to manage too large of an organization, too many clients, this old sort of like light and nimble and sort of familial kind of way. And as you mentioned, like, this is the time where we need a couple things. One of which, of course, is systems. Like, you have to have some repeatability and process. These new people, they weren't in the room when you came up with that process the first time and you like wrote it on a whiteboard and walked away and never wrote it down. So like, they don't know how we onboard clients or whatever the process was. So obviously you need systems, and that's a really key part of it. But the other thing you mentioned is equally important, which is you have to shrink the organization. Like, systems and process are only good enough to a certain point. Because again, and I talk about this a lot, but like, these are creative organizations. We're not making like widgets on an assembly line. It's not perfectly consistent. It's creative, it's bespoke. We have to meet clients where they are. We have to be somewhat nimble. And so the best way we do that is we combine systems with a smaller, more nimble organization like we had when we were smaller. But now that we're bigger, what we have to do is divide the organization up into its component parts, right? We have to assign these lieutenants, these deputies who can manage components of the business in a way that ladders up to the broader organization's goals. And that's just a key operating model shift that you just can't avoid. Like, every firm of a certain size hits the limit of their previous sort of monolithic operating structure and has to start to go to this lieutenant structure with a fleet of ships, to your Royal Navy. And it's pretty obvious to me the clients who need to and haven't. And it again, it manifests itself in these deteriorating margins and deteriorating satisfaction among employees and clients.
Well, I guess I would it be wrong for me to suppose as well that as you are growing, um, you've pointed out how we saw a decline in the gross margin numbers. But would I also expect to see an increase in operating expenditures that are supporting the entire organization? And then, I guess I'm thinking about, okay, I'm adding lieutenants. Those
Yep.
lieutenants presumably are not fully billable, at least not all of them. I have support staff I have to add to the mix. I have an accounting firm I have to hire. I've got all
Yeah.
these things which I didn't need before. So not only am I maybe facing some resistance on gross margin, but I would just automatically assume that my operating expenditures are gonna bloat a little bit until I can outgrow them and get some leverage back in the business. Is that a fair assumption? Did we see
It's
that in the
exactly what
data?
happened. You know what's really interesting though? Like again, if we just look at the data, there's basically two parts of like leadership infrastructure that has to be injected into an organization as they're transitioning from, as you described, the pirate ship to the fleet. One of which is like service leadership, right? These are people who are, execution managers, directors, whatever that looks like. And then there's org leadership, right? These are C-suite kinds of folks. At least in the data, we find that while yes, these leaderships are bloating the average cost a little bit. So like we have to make more money to earn the same margin, or I guess I should say bill at a higher rate to earn the same margin. But the data says like the firms are actually doing a pretty decent job at integrating these people at the right times, such that like the utilization continues to improve as firms get larger. And so like they're digesting, they're implementing it. That's actually working okay. We don't see people like prematurely assigning these sort of service leaders. But to your point, we see OpEx blow up. OpEx blows up. And so that really tanks my operating margin. And like I'd say, listen, you're totally right. There's some element of OpEx is going to have to increase. Like it just, of course, has to because we do need to add these things. I think we see the difference between the firms that are growing and remaining profitable and the firms that are not. And this is another point somewhere here is the ones that are not are the ones that are investing in anticipation or in excitement of revenue growth, right? Like it's coming, it's happening. We got to be ready. We got to bulk up. We got to invest. And there's some element of being proactive. I'm not saying like wake up when the sort of boulder is crushing you, but that behavior, the like, yeah, you know what? I got to go from a 2-person leadership team to a 20-person leadership team because we got to be ready. Like that intuition usually takes you down a path of I mean, A, that's a little bit playing business, but B, it's like it takes you down a path where you end up destroying your margins without investing in the things that are actually going to cause your growth to come to fruition. And usually I see people just like live in that bloated scenario forever until they kind of retreat back down the ladder.
Ooh, well, I tell you, even with some of the clients that I've worked with, and this is anecdotal, so I'm not referring to the study here, but one of the key inflection points that I see along the journey is usually the decision to hire some type of full-time sales or BD or revenue person. And that is almost always a pretty big expenditure to swallow for any agency. It's going to all sit within operating expenditures, but it's viewed as, to your point, a necessary evil or an investment. And I think the unfortunate reality that I've seen play out is everyone just views that as a logical next step to get to where they need to go next, and everything else is a formality. And what I've seen more times than not is they make that hire, they are more likely to invest. I think this is just kind of like a psychological thing, which says, hey, psychologically, I feel a little bit more safe about making additional investments because I already made this big investment in a salesperson. And then suddenly, after 6, 9, 12 months even, salesperson hasn't really brought anything in. And maybe my current clients haven't really grown that much. And then like, oh my God, we just lost a really important client. And now I'm catching a falling knife and I have all these investments I made and it's a double whammy. So not only am I not in a good place to respond, but I've got to cut everybody that I thought I was bringing in to help me grow. And what I've also seen is owners have a really hard time being objective about those situations because they're fearful that if they eliminate some of those revenue minded or growth minded people, um, it will be that much longer until they're able to bring them back again. And I think most people this is kind of like another psychological trick that we all kind of fall into from time to time, which is like, well, I was hoping that this would all fit my 3 to 5 year plan, and now my 3 to 5 year plan just turned to a 10-year plan, and I don't want a 10-year plan, so I'm just gonna try to make it work anyways. And that's where we see a lot of disaster strike. So I know that was a long-winded response. to, but that I'm just calling that out because I'm always focused on revenue. I'm focused on salespeople. That's my world. But as I reflect on clients, even that I've worked with or been close to, um, and it's not because intention isn't good. It is, but man, it's a razor's edge. And if those sales folks don't perform, or if we lose even one massive client, many of these agencies are still vulnerable. And one big client can make or break their year, make or break more than a couple FTEs, make or break the culture within an organization, especially if we thought we were growing and now suddenly we're not, and now things are heading backward, all everybody flees. And I don't know, it really just speaks to sort of the very tenuous nature of the model, and why it's so challenging among many other reasons.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, particularly if it's, project oriented and not recurring in nature. Yeah. Well, let me I want to get into the revenue piece because I think that kind of underpins this whole discussion. Before that we do that though, I guess I just want to talk about maybe one other sort of factor that was kind of central to our conversations about what ultimately is kind of a good sign that these firms were unable or unprepared, ill prepared to grow their revenue. And I'd say, I mean, the thing I wrote down, I don't know if this is like the best way to summarize it, but it's basically like firms that are unable to manage their supply and demand, who ask questions like, should I hire this person or when should I hire this person, right? Who does not have a clear idea of how to, when I say manage supply and demand, because I think like ultimately that's the most sort of foundational operating principle for an agency. It's like the hardest thing it's why running an agency is difficult, especially a project agency. When I say supply and demand, I mean like demand being like the people who want to buy your services and the supply being like the people you've hired to help you deliver those services. And it's like very difficult in many agencies because often the demand is quite variable and it can be very chunky, right? I'd say even an agency that's growing, their revenue can often look like a sine wave, right? With peaks and troughs and peaks and troughs. Even if you drew a trend line up and to the right, it's still peaking and troughing and peaking and troughing. And so trying to determine how do I staff to that sort of sine wave is the biggest challenge. And I think firms who don't have a strong handle over how they're going to answer that question are firms that are not going to see the seed of this phase. And I would say, I mean, to help sort of advise or answer that question, I think there's probably two things. Thing number one, of course, is um, just making the decision, answering the question, like using data, objective information, and not like emotion, right? And so, like knowing what is my sort of current like team utilization slash team capacity at the various levels. What is my booked? So if I take into my booked work. That I haven't maybe started yet. What is my updated kind of utilization capacity at the various levels? And then what's my forecasted 90-day utilization capacity at the various levels on whatever methodology you want, weighted, unweighted, doesn't matter, but just using like real objective data. Because I feel like what often happens is, I'll talk to an agency owner and it's like, yeah, your utilization for your service team's like 50%, right? You got a lot of capacity. It's not, you have too many people for the revenue that you have. And when I looked at your book work, it's basically the same story. And if we look 90 days out, there's nothing far enough in your pipeline that you would consider it. So it's the same story, except that when you and I talk, it's like, yeah, but I had this like awesome phone call this morning and it could be a huge deal. It's going to be 2 million bucks. And what am I going to lay these people off? And then I got to hire them tomorrow because it's such a killer opportunity. And I've got 2 calls next week and it's going to open all these doors for us, right? Like, Craig, you obviously have been part of those conversations too. And listen, I mean, all I'll say about it, and you'd probably agree, is like, listen, we're entrepreneurs, we're optimists. Like, it's the whole reason we did this in the first place. Like, if we were sort of sane, probability adjusted view over what's going on, we probably wouldn't have done this in the first place. But we all believe we can get, upper quartile outcomes. And so we're optimists. And so we're not, when we think about our pipeline emotionally, we think like, oh yeah, it's just everything's going to change on the other side of this week. And so of course I can't make any staffing decisions. And that's just not the way to make important supply-based conversation. You got to put your optimist cap in the drawer. You just got to look at the cold hard data and make your choices from that specifically.
Yeah. We could do a dedicated episode just to sort of the psychological state of an owner and common pitfalls I think that occur in different areas of the business and different times along the journey or spots along the journey. Um, what I would say to any owner who is worried about having staff ahead of time or having resources ahead of time or running their team too hot is I would much rather hire too late than too early, for a number of reasons, unless I am a large business, right? Unless I can consume those marginal costs in a way which don't really materially degrade my gross margin or my P&L at large. But if I'm under 40 people, I'm still very careful about when I hire, and I'd much rather squeeze the team. Um, no offense to them, of course, but I'd much rather squeeze the team temporarily than overinvest and then have to go ahead and lay off that person I just hired and maybe lay off a couple people just because psychologically I think it's harder to come back from that than it is to say, oh yeah, I'm sorry we had a tough month of work. We everybody worked really hard. I'm going to take everybody out to dinner or whatever, right? And I would much rather have the problem of um growth than the opposite. I'd much rather deal with those issues with my team as well. But I just want to touch on what you mentioned specifically around being an optimist, because I'll be honest with you, and you probably know about this about me now, is at my best days, I'm a realist, and most days I'm a pessimist. And that's because I've looked after revenue for a really long time now, both at this organization and others, and I've had a number of difficult conversations with owners and with investors when we don't hit the goals that we put out there. And especially when it's team members of mine who are managing deals and they promise me the world and they come back with nothing, and then it's really me on the line that has to go to the executive leadership and say, hey, I know I told you this was coming, but it's not, right? And so because of that, I have just kind of turned into the ultimate pessimist slash realist, like I said, on a good day. And it's why I am a strong believer in very very good pipeline hygiene. I'm really big on making sure that we're updating the pipeline and that we're being as realistic as possible, that we are paying attention to things like close dates, that we are very specific about terms of contracts, that we're very specific about dollar amounts as that information becomes available, that we, as much as we use the weighted average method ourselves when we're trying to forecast out revenue, as a revenue owner, I know that's a very imperfect method because it's very unusual that I win half of a deal. It's much more common I either win it or I don't, right? And so, when I'm in that stage of, "Hey, I have a proposal out," I'm doing everything I can to remove the risk from that proposal and get us to the signature. And I'm being very vocal and I'm communicating multiple times a day with the leadership team or with my other partners or with the rest of the organization as to what could be coming or what could not. And I would much rather say, hey, I don't think this is likely. Let's not count on it. And then come back with a surprise later on and say, oh my God, they changed their mind. They signed, right? And there, obviously there are a number of reasons for that. But I see 80% of the time, a lot of the revenue challenges we have with our clients that we've worked with in the past, and let me just push aside the fact that like maybe they're just having a hard time finding clients. Maybe that their services aren't in demand like they used to be, right? Like all these things ebb and flow, and everyone has different aptitude at selling their wares, so to speak. But if you're able to at least do that to some degree of effectiveness, and you have a pipeline, dishonesty within the pipeline um, will kill your business faster than just about anything else. I mean, there are certainly other catastrophic decisions you could make, but it is that dishonesty which takes a good business into an average business, into an underperforming business. Now nobody wants to work there anymore. Now you're thinking about drawing on the line of credit. Now you don't know where the next deal is going to come from to cover the draw that you took out of the line of credit. And oh my God, just like the old quote, I think it might be Ernest Hemingway said, "How do you go bankrupt? At first slowly and then suddenly all at once." And that's what happens with a lot of our clients is they don't suspect they have issues, and then, "Oh my god, 2 bad quarters, and what am I dealing with here?" And so it's because of that, and because we've seen that so many times, I for me, that pipeline is life and death all the time. Even when things are really good, even when I'm on that growth trajectory, it is life and death all the time. Because if I take anything less than that level of professional responsibility to the pipeline, then I'm bound to make a mistake or make an error in judgment or forecast inappropriately, which will maybe not affect me as the sales leader or as the owner in a way that is terribly detrimental, but it's probably going to affect somebody that I care about on my team because I'm probably going to have to cut them or reduce pay or furlough or whatever. And I don't want that. I take that responsibility very seriously as a business owner. And so I cannot stress enough the amount of professional attention and detail that needs to be given to a pipeline in the management of deals and the amount of honesty that it's to your benefit to have, in order to grow the right way, because otherwise, you're just playing with fire, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, listen, you're robbing the organization of the one thing it needs to address this, which is time and flexibility and optionality. Like it's just, I know it hurts to take your medicine and be realistic about what a situation is, but it's always going to come out in the end. And that may be 2 months from now when you've blown through some cash and now there's nothing you can do about it. Whereas a couple months ago, there is something that you could do about it.
That's right. And a couple months is a lot, right? I mean, for any of our organizations, a couple bad months can make or break an entire year, and it's hard to recoup from that.
Yeah, I mean, listen. The only other thing on this topic, and I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to this, but I mean, your conversation about the approach and care with which to approach the pipeline was a good kind of reminder, which is like, I think something that kind of maybe broadly summarizes some of the things that organizations might do when they're maybe not quite ready for growth is just in general treat some of these things sort of like a spreadsheet exercise and not like a real like this is what's required, right? So when I say that, I just mean like this kind of mentality or idea that's like, okay, well, I have my, I got my 5-year plan, and well, I got to hire these people, and just by the nature of hiring them, that's going to sort of manifest itself into this
It'll
growth,
be a
and then I got to hire
formality,
these
yeah.
people. Yeah, it's like it's just all going to come together. Like this is how it works because I listened to a podcast or I read a book or whatever it is, and so I can spreadsheet my way to some outcome. And you can't do that. You can't do that with regard to anything, but you certainly can't do that with regard to revenue generation, right? And I think you would agree that a number of folks that struggle with growth do so because they're not approaching that sort of discipline with the right level of intentionality or care or focus.
Yeah. And you see this just as frequently as I do. I like analogies because I have a very simple brain, and I like sports analogies because they're easy to get across. But I liken that type of behavior to someone who would be like a football coach, who wants to put together a really good playbook and then has already decided they've won the game before it started, right? And we this is something that we actually talk a lot to our team internally, which is you can't run the business from a spreadsheet. I can predict a number of outcomes. I can provide useful information to make good decisions, hopefully good quality decisions from. It is important. We do have to put good plays in place, and this helps us to build an overall game plan and a strategy, right? But the game is won and lost on the field of play, and the field of play is where I'm out with my team each and every day. And if I need to adjust the plays, and in our world, that would probably be the spreadsheets, to adjust expectation or to redeploy money elsewhere or whatever, any of these things that come up frequently, yes, we could do that. But just because you've put it down on paper does not mean it will become true, because you have to go manifest it out in the real world. And unfortunately, it is something that we've seen quite a few times, that people, especially if they hire us, they feel like we've helped them put together a plan, a forecast, projections, whatever you want to call it, in place. And they've never done anything like that before. And it feels really good. It feels very formal. And they all think, well, this is what's going to happen. I just need to hire, two more people, and here we go. And we end up having a lot of awkward conversations with those types of owners, because ultimately they come right back and say, like, hey, that didn't really work out. What should I do next? Right. And I think that's another area where, especially those who've been through it many times before, either on a leadership team, or you've owned a couple agencies, those folks who understand that the thing that makes or breaks all of us is that on the field of play, are the folks that are best positioned to go out and grow an agency, because they know what it takes, and they know the relationships they have to have, and they know how to hire great staff, and they know what a good salesperson looks like and does not look like, right? And so um we've seen that in our own businesses. And it's another thing that I try to stress with owners is, listen, I know we put this plan together, but that does not mean it is reality yet. You have to go that true. And so let's be very careful about additional investments we make until we can show that the actions which are showing up on the field are tying to, or are at least somewhat connected to, the plan that we put in place. So I don't know. It's a little bit out there, but it is it's very important.
Yeah. Yep. Um, I agree. Well, listen, Craig, I don't know. I feel like we have anything else you want to add here? I mean, I feel like we have it surrounded. This is, obviously,
Do you think it's possible to distill down into, because this is what I think most people would want if they're listening, to distill down into like a checklist to say, like, yes, if you've done these couple things well enough, you're ready for growth, and the right kind of growth, right? Because I think that's what we're after. That's what we're trying to communicate here is, you can't just be growth for growth's sake necessarily, and you have to be ready for it. But could you distill it down into like three or four things, and maybe it's less than that, that these agencies need before they embark on that growth journey?
yeah, I think it's, well, I mean, I'm going to be a little bit self serving by pointing back to some things that we've already built that I think do a really good job of this already. So if you're working with us, hopefully you've done this stuff. But I mean, again, the first thing I mentioned right out of the gate is, and you talked about it with regard to your ladder analogy. Like, I think you've got to commit. You've got to make sure your team is on the same page about what we're doing here, what we are seeking to achieve, and what is going to be required. I mean, even back to your point where it's like, I would much rather hire a little bit behind demand than a little bit ahead of demand. I totally agree with you for a number of reasons. That's part of growing successfully. But we all have to be on the same page about the fact that that's where we work. We work at a place that's growing, and we are going to get pinched in certain moments. Like, we just have to all like hold hands, sign our sort of, metaphorical contract that this is what it's in. It's got to be worth it for us. Like, you got to be the kind of people where that's exciting and rewarding and worth it. But that's number one. Like, we all have to be on the same page about the game that we're playing. And then structurally speaking, I think there's basically like two buckets. The first bucket is like, you've got to have a business that is sustainable, repeatable, profitable before you can throw. It's like building a fire, right? Like, you do have to have a little bit of an ember here that's working. You have to have like the logs that are positioned in the right. I was never a Boy Scout, but you get the idea. Like, we have to have a structure here that's ready for
Profitability is not
gasoline.
not going to come later if I haven't
It's not
already
gonna come
figured it
later.
out, is what
You're
I'm
not gonna solve your profit problems with more revenue. Almost never, unless you're like itty bitty. But the most profitable kind of business is that 11 to 25 in our survey. So if you're not a profitable business at 11 to 25, you ain't going to get more profitable. You're going to get less profitable initially, right? It doesn't get easier, it gets harder. So, like, yeah, you've got to build your little thing. And we, again, go check out our podcast on the hierarchy of financial needs. Like, we have this whole sequential framework to help you think about getting from what is not a profitable organization to one that is generating repeatable revenue generation and has good gross and net margins. And then I think the third thing is, and again, we've published a grow mode playbook. It is like once you have built a fire, right? Like, you've taken your little ember and you've put the newspaper and the little small logs next to it, right? You got a fire. You put your first log on it. Great. Now we're good. That's like my 25-person firm. You're about to pour a little bit of gasoline on that fire, and it's about to get a lot bigger, a lot quicker. You've got to make sure that you now have the infrastructure to control that, right? So again, if I keep my fire analogy, I'm in the middle of the woods. It's dry. It's windy. I've got a bunch of dry grass around. That is going to be a forest fire, right? Like it's not. I have to have the infrastructure that is going to take that gasoline and make a large controlled fire. And this is again in our grow mode playbook. That's the idea of um, dividing the organization into its component parts, promoting my deputies and giving them goals that ladder up to the org-wide goals and holding them accountable to them and aligning their incentives, right? That's your whole moving from the pirate ship to the British Royal Navy, right? So if I can, align my attitude and like get everybody on the same page about what we're on, what journey we're on, and then build that profitable small firm through using the hierarchy of financial needs, and then I, when needed, reorient myself for the growth that will sustain me into scale through these component parts and these lieutenants or deputies. I think that puts me in the best possible position to be successful. Obviously, on the field of play, there's all sorts of things we have to react to, but that's at least the structure of team that has the best chance of success.
Okay. That's awesome. Thank you, Ryan, for that. I really appreciate that. And hopefully the audience does too.
Okay, great. All right. Well, until next time, thanks for joining.
Thanks, guys.